Let's bring in the jury.
Yes, sir.
Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. Detective, you're still under oath. Ms. Gulledge.
Thank you very much. Now, Detective Spataro, you could tell we ended that interview before the full and complete recording was over. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
But from the point at which we ended the video, was there any additional interviewing of the defendant being conducted by you or Sergeant Pullen?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And was that the period of time when he was just sitting and waiting to be transported?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And as we all witnessed, it was a little difficult sometimes to hear you on that recording. If I can draw your attention specifically to, I think you were telling the defendant about a conversation you had with his mother. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the point when that audio got difficult to hear when we were listening to you speaking to the defendant?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell us what you were telling the defendant about his conversation, about your conversation with his mother?
Yes, ma'am. His mother had contacted me when we were originally trying to locate Mr. Eubanks. She said that she had not heard from him or had seen him. And she was concerned that if she had, that we would hurt her son. I tried to assure her that wasn't it, but he needed to turn himself in. She said that I was ripping her heart out, and I said, I'm sorry. She said that she doesn't feel good about it and didn't want to have the conversation anymore, and that was the end of it.
Okay. Now, when you are interviewing a witness, interviewing a suspect, do you work to build a rapport with that person?
Yes.
And during that rapport building, do you also try and determine perhaps what techniques or what approach may be the most effective in eliciting information from that person?
Objection to leaving, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes, ma'am.
And in this particular case, what was your tactic with this defendant?
It was a soft approach. When I made contact with Mr. Eubanks for the first time at Orange County, before transporting him back, I could tell that he was somebody that needed a soft approach, just by the way he conducted himself, the way he was talking, he just needed some comfort. And then once we got into the vehicle and he just started talking and opening up, I realized that that was an approach that I was going to have to use in order to get information.
And so as the juror saw you referring to him by his first name or offering him a beverage, other comforts, those types of things, is that part of that same approach, Detective Spataro?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Now, I know earlier in your testimony this morning, you were talking about speaking with Melanie and her daughter at the hospital. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever follow up with Melanie and have a sort of a more formal conversation with her about the events that had transpired on August 25th?
Yes, ma'am.
And where did that interview take place, or when did that interview take place?
It was at the Belmont Police Department, and if I could look up to find out exactly when that interview
Yes,
took
please,
place.
thank you. Detective Spataro, if I could ask you this way, was it before or after the defendant was in custody that you brought her back to interview her?
I apologize it's taken so long. to
That's all
court.
right.
It was 9:27 at 4:30 PM.
Okay. $9:27 or $8:27? Was it 4 days or 3 days after the event or a month after the event?
A few days after the event.
Thank you. And Detective Spataro, are you familiar with the Children's Advocacy Center here in Gaston County?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know what the purpose of the Children's Advocacy Center is?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you refer Jaden Eubanks to the Children's Advocacy Center for an interview?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a regular crime scene detective who works with the Belmont Police Department?
Yes, ma'am.
At the time, did you also reach out to and rely on the Gaston County Police Department for assistance with crime scene investigation sometimes?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that what you did in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
And did a Gaston County crime scene detective assist with looking at the house, photographs, things like that?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were telling us earlier as well that Melanie's car, that Infiniti car, was towed back to the police department. To your knowledge, was that vehicle processed by Detective Howell as well?
Yes, ma'am.
To your knowledge, was a hammer recovered in that vehicle?
Yes, ma'am.
Did your department submit that hammer as well as DNA samples from the victim and from the defendant to the state crime lab for analysis?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, I don't have any additional questions right now.
Mr. Taylor, cross-examination.
So what type of training?
I've had Police Law Institute, which is PLI. I've had numerous hours of yearly training through the North Carolina Justice Academy, as well as additional specialized training with domestic violence.
Do you take yearly updates to maintain your education?
Yes, sir.
And I think you said earlier that you're not limited to one type of investigation. And by that I mean you're not only a homicide investigator or only a domestic violence investigator, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And how many detectives are there at Belmont?
Currently, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 part-time.
And how are responsibilities distributed? How do you end up with certain cases?
We're on a rotation.
So it's what comes in, basically?
Yes.
Now, what is your role as an investigator? What's the first thing you're trying to do when you go in and investigate?
Get the facts.
Okay. And that includes the physical facts, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And in this case, what was your first knowledge of the case? How did you get your first knowledge?
I was called in reference to a domestic assault.
Who called you in?
Arthur Pullen.
All right. You did not speak to the victim when you were called in on this case, is that correct?
That is correct.
And did you go out and visit the actual site? Did you visit their home?
Not immediately.
All right. Did you visit their home before you went to the hospital?
No.
Did you visit the home when Detective Howell was processing the crime scene?
No, sir.
Who was in charge of the crime scene?
In charge of the crime scene. I would say Eddie Howell, since he was the detective who was processing it.
All right. He's who Ms. Gullidge referred to as the person who goes in and processes the evidence, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So, you did not talk to him before then about what the nature of the possible charges might be, is that correct?
That's correct.
And he didn't bring the charges, I take it, is that correct?
That is correct.
It would be fair to say you were the lead investigator, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you could request, I take it, for him to do certain things if you felt they were necessary as part of his processing of the crime scene.
Yes, sir.
Can he take his own initiative and decide what to do also?
Yes, he could.
All right. Did you discuss with him what choices, if any, he made and what processing he did at the crime scene?
I did not.
And I take it the hammer that is the focus of this, that was in the car, we've heard testimony that there was a hammer in the car, was not at the crime scene, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the hammer was tested, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you request that it be tested?
Yes, sir.
Do you know if fingerprints were done on that hammer?
I believe it was just DNA.
And I'm trying to get a timeline here. So you're called in to do the investigation and you go to see the victim in the hospital. Was that your first act?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you testified this morning that when you walked in, she looked terrified. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that you observed that she had injuries to her head and a broken jaw. Did you observe the broken jaw?
At the time, I did not know it was broken, but her face was very swollen.
And that's what I'm asking, because your testimony this morning was that you observed a broken jaw. What you actually observed was a bloody damage to her head and a swollen face. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And she was able to talk to you.
Yes, sir.
You might have some difficulty doing it, but she was able to make herself. And you said that she said to you that Mr. Eubanks bludgeoned her with a hammer. Is that what she said?
Struck him, hit her with a hammer.
And again, you said that Mr. Eubanks said he bludgeoned her with that hammer. Do you recall where you heard him say that?
No, I believe he said he struck her repeatedly with a hammer.
So the term bludgeon is your term.
Yes, sir, it is.
And you know how important it is to be accurate about what you discover, what the facts are, rather than leaping to a conclusion when you're investigating. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But you do a fair amount of domestic violence investigation. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
Had you had any contact with either of the Eubanks prior to that night?
No, sir.
So I want to return to what I asked you first. So your source of knowledge of what went on that night when you first went to see Miss Eubanks, was from where?
From Lieutenant Pullen.
Okay. And do you have any idea where his knowledge came from?
I believe, I can't speak for him.
I'm just asking, do you have an idea? If you discussed it with him, have you discussed it with him?
I would say he got the information from the officers on scene.
Do you know whether Officer Pullen or Detective Pullen had talked to Ms. Eubanks before you did?
I do not know that, sir.
All right. Did you talk to any doctor before you talked to Ms. Eubanks?
No, sir.
Do you know how long she was in the hospital before you got there?
No, sir.
Did you observe her receiving any treatment while you were there?
She was receiving some treatment, yes.
All right. You weren't asked to leave the room, I take it?
No, sir.
Now, what was your next step after visiting Miss Eubanks in the hospital?
Was to follow up on the information that I got from her.
I believe you said your next step was to try and find Mr. Eubanks.
Yes,
Is that
sir.
right? And again, I'll ask you, at that point, did you go out and even visit the scene?
I had not, no.
All right. Do you know whether the Eubanks were still married?
Yes,
And do you know whether Mr. Eubanks was under any restraining order at the time that would have kept him from being around Ms. Eubanks?
no, sir.
You don't know, or he was not?
No, I wasn't aware if he had been.
All right. So you focused on Orange County and finding him, is that correct?
Yes.
Who did you talk to?
I talked to Ravonda Jessup, who is sister to Melanie. I also talked to, give me a moment, if I can refer to my notes, please.
Please do.
Charles' Aunt Debbie, a cousin Thomas, and then his mother.
Did you track down his Aunt Debbie, or did she contact you?
I got Debbie's phone number from Ravonda. I called her, and then she called me back.
And did she tell you anything that would help you locate Mr. Eubanks?
Just that she had talked to her son Thomas, and that he had gone, that Charles had showed up at his apartment earlier that morning.
Right. She had not had any contact with Charles, though, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Did you have a liaison with either Hillsborough or Orange County that you were talking to, or the detectives?
Not really, no.
Right. Had you talked to Major Jones before he came here today?
Yes, yes, sir.
I mean, while the investigation was going on, not before this trial?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, did you inform him of what you knew about the case?
No, sir, let me clarify. I spoke to Mr. Jones when I went to Orange County. So Lieutenant.
That was when you went, after they had found Mr. Eubanks?
That's correct. I was dealing with dispatch and providing them information. Yes, sir.
And you told dispatch what was going on here at this end, is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you ever tell dispatch that he was charged with attempted murder?
Assault with a deadly weapon.
Right. So that was the term you used because that's what he was charged with.
Yes,
is that
sir.
correct? And you heard Major Jones say that he thought he was charged with attempted murder, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you know, and I understand if you don't, but do you know whether anybody, to your knowledge, had talked to Mr. Eubanks before he was taken out of the car about what if any charges he was facing?
Just what I witnessed from the officers that testified earlier from Orange County.
All right, so during your investigation, though, you didn't report, and no one that you know of from here reported that he was charged with attempted murder?
No, because I have the documents that I actually sent over.
You said that when you talked to his mother, she said she was worried police would hurt her son, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you have any discussion with her why she would be worried about that?
I did not. I just told her that we were not going to hurt her son. That wasn't the intent at all.
You weren't supervising Orange County and Hillsborough then at that point?
Well, that is true. Yes, sir.
And as part of your tasks as the lead detective, you determine the initial charges in any case, right?
Yes, sir.
When do you make that determination?
After talking to the victim, I mean,
Do you feel-
Objection. That has to be heard outside the presence of the jury.
Members of the jury, I'm going to send you out to the jury deliberation room for just a minute, and I'll have you brought back in. Okay, Mr. Sheriff.
Yes. Make sure you leave your notes.
Objections overruled. Ms. Goldge.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. A charge in and of itself is not evidence in a case, and the fact that a defendant has been charged certainly is no evidence of guilt one way or the other. I have a feeling where Mr. Taylor is going with this is the fact that the detective sought initially a warrant for assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, inflicting serious injury, thereby suggesting that she thought that it was not, in fact, attempted murder, which is what he is standing on trial for now. I think this line of questioning is improper and is unlawful, and I would ask Your Honor to sustain my objection.
Mr. Taylor?
Well, I don't see how it's any more improper than asking earlier officers whether he was charged with attempted murder, whether he said he was charged with attempted murder. That was the first thing out of Officer Major Jones' mouth, was that it was attempted murder, and we've heard nothing but attempted murder since the start of this. I understand your concern. I'm not going to ask her how charges are determined or whether they can change. You can do that on cross, Ms. Gullidge. I'm just asking how the charge was brought and who determined what that charge was. That's all I've asked so far.
And Your Honor, the comments about attempted murder at the beginning of this trial had to do with the mindset of the defendant, and that is especially relevant in a case where his intent is what is being questioned. This is entirely different.
Well, the first part that the court saw was to get him out of the car. You're not charged with attempted murder. Is that not correct? It was on the video?
That's-
Or the testimony?
The testimony of Officer Hendricks was
Yeah,
that he did
Hendricks.
tell the
Yeah.
defendant that he
Right.
told him he was charged with an assault. Yes, sir, that's
Mr.
correct.
Taylor, is that your question?
My question was, I just want to be clear, because I don't think it's clear, although Ms. Gullidge disagrees. It's clear to the jury that his charge was, throughout everything they've heard so far, assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury.
Okay.
That was his charge at that time. And there's been a lot of talk from the investigators about whether he said, I'm charged with attempted murder, or what his knowledge of the charges were, or what indeed their knowledge of the charges were. I had to cross-examine Major Jones to get him to agree that he never actually heard my client, say it was attempted murder, and that he never heard anyone else with any authority say it was attempted murder. He didn't say where he got that information from.
Ms. Goetz?
Your Honor, we are opening the door to having to go down what is a very complex path of explaining to this jury how charges are brought along, the fact that a defendant can be charged with one charge, that can be upgraded, that those charges need to be presented to our grand jury who finds probable cause that they exist. By questioning at this stage whether or not he was charged with the alphabet assault or attempted murder, I think is going to make things very confusing and is ultimately going to leave them with a lot of questions that lawfully I don't believe we're going to be able to answer for them.
I think you can answer any question that you think the jury has, except by law, you cannot read an indictment to the jury. Otherwise, you can present any evidence you'd like concerning charges.
Thank you, Your Honor. My question was, Detective, and you made the determination about the charges, the first charges to be brought in this investigation, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
So there was you can't think of any reason anyone would have communicated any other charge to anyone at that stage?
Not at that stage.
All right. Now, you had testified earlier today, and I may have misunderstood, but I believe when you were talking about Jaden's actions during this, you said that she fled and then Mr. Eubanks kept striking Ms. Eubanks. Do you recall testifying to that?
Yes, sir, I do.
And let me be clear, you were not a witness to that, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And Jaden fled the scene, so that didn't come from Jaden, I take it, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so your source of knowledge for that, I would take it, was Ms. Eubanks?
Yes, sir.
All right. So your belief is that Ms. Eubanks testified that he did not stop whatever she testified he was doing when Jaden entered the room, is that correct?
No, I believe he did stop. When Jaden came down, he stopped and went towards Jaden, tripped and fell, and then Jaden left.
But your testimony was he then continued to strike after Jaden left.
That was my belief.
That was your belief, or That's what I'm asking. What did you base that?
That was my understanding in the beginning of during the initial interviewing process and the
So-
investigation, so at the hospital.
Okay, so again, I'm gonna ask you, you don't believe Jaden entering the room caused him to stop his actions, is that correct?
Objection.
Sustain, answer your question again, Mr.
All
Taylor.
right. When I asked you if you understood him to continue his actions after Jaden fled, you said that was your belief. Is that correct?
That's correct, based on earlier interviews.
I understand that.
Yes, sir.
So I'm saying your belief that things continued means that Jaden's entry into the room didn't stop whatever was going on.
I am just relaying the information that I was given by Ms. Eubanks and Jaden.
I'm
In
just
the
trying to determine where the source of that information was from.
It was from Jaden and from her mother.
How could Jaden have testified to what happened after she fled the room?
She couldn't have.
Exactly, that's all I'm asking. So it wasn't your belief, your testimony from wherever you got it is, your belief that the facts will show that things continued after Jaden
Objection,
fled.
asked and answered.
Let him ask the question. Go ahead.
Is that correct?
Can you please restate the question?
Yes. Your belief is that the facts as you know them are that Mr. Eubanks continued whatever the activity was after Jaden left the house.
Yes, sir.
That's what I want to know. Thank you. Now, Detective, Ms. Gulledge asked you about establishing rapport with Mr. Eubanks and other witnesses, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's a good technique to allow people to be open with you, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You watched, and you were there, you watched the video today of Mr. Eubanks' statement, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say that Sergeant Pullen did that interrogation?
He did a lot of it, yes, sir.
All right. Was that something you two had planned before the interrogation?
He and I usually work as a team.
And have you found that to be effective?
Yes, sir.
And you had established a fair amount of rapport with Mr. Eubanks on the way back from Orange County, is that not true?
Yes, sir.
And you were there to maintain that rapport during the interrogation, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
It would be fair to say that you felt that Mr. Eubanks trusted you, is that correct?
I felt we had a rapport.
And in fact, you said at the end of the statement that you were going to check in on him, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you have checked in on him, haven't you?
Yes, sir.
And part of your duties as an officer is to take care of the whole of the citizenry, is that right?
Yes.
And have you found it that usually people who are volunteering rather than under duress give more complete and full statements?
Yes, usually.
Is there anything different that Mr. Eubanks volunteered to you on the ride back from Orange County from what he stated in the video that we all saw?
I think it was similar.
They're never exactly the same, would that be fair to say?
That's fair to say, yes.
And as part of your duties as an officer, you have to either record or take notes of everything that you do in your investigation, is that correct?
Yes.
Because you do a fair amount of different investigations, and you want those reports to be complete, is that correct?
Yes.
And those reports are then filed as part of the case file, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
If you typewrite a report, just like the video was made part of the case file, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
approach Detective Spataro.
Yes, sir.
Detective, I'm going to hand you what I have marked as Defendant's Exhibit 2, which is a two-page document.
Yes, sir.
What I have marked as Defendant's Exhibit 3, which is a single-page document, and Defendant's Exhibit 4, which is also single-page. For purposes of the record, Defendant's Exhibit 2 has been marked 3/2/2020 and 3/60 as a bait stamp. That Defendant's Exhibit 3 at the bottom is 3/2/2020, 2/25 as a bait stamp, and Defendant's Exhibit 4 is marked 3/2/2020 and 2/26 as a bait stamp at the bottom. You did not do those numbers, I take it, is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you look at those documents and tell me whether you recognize them? Just tell me if you recognize them.
I recognize. Yes, sir.
And now, if you will turn to Defendant's Exhibit 2 and tell me, do you feel, if you recognize that document, what do you recognize it to be?
It's just a narrative about taking out the warrant for the assault
All right.
with a deadly weapon of intent to kill.
Who made that narrative?
There, it is not initialed.
That was not your narrative, is that correct?
Usually I'll say this detective, which would be indicative of me, but I did not initial this on this
So
one.
You don't remember and you don't recognize that as your narrative? I'm just asking.
This is something that I would say. This is something how I would talk, this detective. However, I did not initial it. You are correct. I did not initial it, but this does look familiar to me.
So I'm just gonna ask you to take the time to read through it and see if that improves your memory as to who drafted that document and what you recognize.
It doesn't have my initials, so I can't be 100%.
Do you believe that you routinely, with every narrative that you file in a case file, you initial it before you file it?
Yes, usually I do.
Same questions with Exhibit 3.
Okay. Which would be this one here, the last one, the 2 pages?
Whatever the blue sticker says at the bottom.
Jeez.
Exhibit 3.
Yeah, yeah, 3 is the only one that's, this one's not initialed, but 2 is initialed.
All right, so I'm not trying to confuse you. Exhibit 2 is the 2-page document.
That is correct, yes, sir.
And that is not initialed.
It is initialed.
So then I will go back to Exhibit 2 and I will ask you, since it's initialed, do you recognize that document?
Yes,
And what do you recognize it to be?
I recognize it to be a narrative of when Sergeant Poland and I had gone to Hillsborough and Orange County Sheriff's Office to pick up the defendant.
And who drafted that narrative?
I did, sir.
Thank you. And having read it, has it been changed or corrected or modified in any way from your report?
This one here?
Exhibit 2, is just what we're talking about?
Yes,
That's all.
originally.
It has been modified?
This document,
Okay.
Yes.
May I approach you, Honor?
Yes, sir.
yes,
Trying not to be confusing. Let's take one document at a time.
Yes.
All right? All right, so
2.
this says Exhibit 2 down here.
Yes.
Right? And other than these numbers here,
yes.
you've had a chance to read the whole thing. Is that
Yes.
correct? Did you draft that document?
I did draft this document.
Do you recognize it to be a copy of your report as filed in the case file?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Yes,
And
yes,
it hasn't been altered in any way that you can see?
that I can see.
All right, thank you. And you tried to be complete when you made that report, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Right, same questions with regard to document 3.
Document 3 looks like something I would type up, but it is not initialed.
All right. Do you have any independent knowledge or any way to verify what that is? Other than if it would have been initialed?
I mean, the information is accurate. It just doesn't have the initials down there.
Well, and again, I'm not asking you, although I appreciate your answer, what I'm asking you is, do you recall whether you produced that document? Is that your information in that?
I cannot say 100%.
All right, thank you. And I'm asking the same things with Exhibit 4.
Now, this one would be me, sir, because my name is down here at the bottom left.
All right, so Exhibit 4 is something you do recognize.
Yes, sir.
Have you got a chance to examine it?
Yes, sir.
What is it?
It is a arrest information sheet.
And is that a normal sheet that you process when you're investigating a crime?
Yes, sir.
And does that reflect who is the subject of that arrest sheet?
It does.
Who?
Mr. Eubanks?
Has that document been altered in any fashion since you, other than the numbers at the bottom identifying the date and the bait stamp, has that been altered in any way since you filled it out?
No, sir.
All right, thank you. May I retrieve those documents?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And I take it you reviewed your case file before you came to testify?
Yes, sir, I did.
So much of what you testified to is both your independent recollection and things that you made notes of at the time, is that correct?
That's correct.
And those are contained in these types of documents, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you try to make those documents as accurate as possible and as complete as possible, is that
Yes, sir.
correct? Okay. Had you heard the 911 call prior to interviewing Ms. Eubanks?
Yes, sir.
How did that come about?
I requested it from Gaston County Communications.
All right. Other than that 911 call, had anyone briefed you on anything that might have occurred at the house that night prior to you talking to Ms. Eubanks?
Just Lieutenant Pullen, or Sergeant Pullen at the time.
All right, thank you. Okay, just a moment. Children's Advocacy Center that you were asked about earlier, were you present at any interviews at the Children's Advocacy Center?
I can't recollect if I was there for that.
So you don't recall, you don't have an independent recollection of whatever those interviews might have said?
I do. I have the discs. I have the CDs. I have the recorded
So
video.
your recollection would come from looking at a recording of that, is that what you're saying?
For the CAC, yes, sir.
Okay. Does that refresh your recollection as to whether you were present for the interviews? Does it?
It does not, sir. I'm sorry.
In the time that you spent with Mr. Eubanks, did he ever display any type of violence?
No, sir.
Did he
Objection, relevance.
Overruled. You can answer.
In establishing your rapport with him, did you have to keep him from being overly emotional at any time?
No, sir.
And he fairly well volunteered everything that you testified to that he said, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And would it be a fair statement to say he was very cooperative with Sergeant Pullen's interrogation while you were sitting there, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In fact, he acknowledged that he was doing this knowing that it might create some problems, did he not?
Yes, sir.
And when you checked on him, has he recognized you?
Yes.
Do you feel you still have that rapport with him?
I can't say that.
Do you not ask him to hug it out before you leave him?
At the jail that time, yes.
So that's what I'm asking. So you still have that rapport, do you not?
I did then.
Oh, I see.
I-
So you maybe not today. I'm saying prior to trial. I
Yes,
understand
sir.
what you're saying.
Yes, sir.
Okay. But he has never demonstrated that all of a sudden he's flipped and thought you were somehow unworthy of his rapport.
Not to my knowledge, sir,
All right.
no.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect, Ms. Goins?
Yes, please. Detective Spataro, Mr. Taylor was asking you about any fingerprints on the hammer, whether there was a request made for any fingerprints on the hammer. Based on your investigation, interviews conducted with the defendant and the victim, did you have any information that would lead you to believe anyone other than the defendant had held the hammer?
No, sir. No, ma'am. Ma'am.
And when he was inquiring as to your observations at the hospital, did you later learn that Melanie's jaw had in fact been fractured or broken?
Yes, ma'am.
Especially early on in investigations, do you regularly rely on information coming in from other officers, from your sergeant, your superiors, so that you can each sort of go different directions and each complete parts of the investigation as needed?
Yes, ma'am.
And you indicated that or that the defendant initially was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill, inflicting serious injury. Did you later seek indictment by the grand jury for attempted murder?
Yes.
I have no other questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Taylor, any recross?
Briefly, Your Honor. You're saying there was never any indication to you that that hammer was handled by anyone other than Mr. Eubanks, is that correct?
That's correct.
You have no recollection of Ms. Eubanks saying that she might have grabbed the hammer?
If I can please refer to my notes.
Actually, I'm asking if you have a recollection right now.
I want to give you the.
Go ahead and refer to your notes. I'm not trying to trick you.
No, I know you're not. That's why I'm just.
All right, but go ahead. Refer to your notes.
Yes, sir.
And what's your answer now that you referred to your notes?
That when the hammer flew out of his hand, she tried to grab it. And
So the answer has changed then, that maybe someone else did handle it.
yes, sir.
Right. Thank you. And, not to belabor the point, but when did you complete your investigation so that you were able to charge Mr. Eubanks?
After interviewing Melanie and speaking to her daughter, stating that Melanie is a witness herself, saying that her husband did it, and her daughter observing and witnessing her father doing it to her mother.
So he was actually charged before you talked to him, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And after you talked to him, and after you secured the car from Orange County and told Detective Howell what to do, when did you ever close the file and say, okay, I'm not doing any more investigation on this matter?
Eventually, yes.
And that's what I'm asking about, when was that?
I guess it would have been up until the day that you guys came in and reviewed evidence, sir.
Ah, all right. And when was he charged with attempted murder?
He was charged with attempted murder. The warrant was taken out on 8/25/2019
For attempted murder?
for assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill.
Ms. Gullidge just asked you whether you determined and took out a charge, indictment for attempted murder. My question is, when did you do that?
Oh, I believe it was a true bill of indictment.
Counsel approach. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let me ask it in a different way. When did you take your last act in seeking new evidence or evidence in this investigation? Approximately, I'm not looking for, do you have any idea?
Like September, October
Of,
2019.
okay. No further questions, Your Honor.
Anything further, Ms. Gullidge?
Detective Spataro, the information you testified to just a moment ago was that Melanie indicated to you that she tried to reach for the hammer. Was that what you had testified to?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Nothing else.
Anything further, Mr. Taylor?
No.
You can step down, Detective. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.